It's the world this week, and we're not in Paris, which is unusual for the show. Yes, we're in London. Normally, at this time, we'd be sitting around the desk in the French capital. We would have discussed things like articles of impeachment against the U.S. president, the massive strikes in France, Greta Thunberg getting Time Magazine's Person of the Year, Abiy Ahmed receiving his Nobel Peace Prize, Aung San Suu Kyi before the International Criminal Court in The Hague defending Myanmar. Not this week, though. There's a blue wave that swept down upon the Thames and into that building across the way at Westminster. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Let's say hello to London editor Nico. HINES, did you get any sleep last night?
I've had 2 hours. I'm feeling good.
2 hours. That's on the high end of the...
Yeah, it's plenty.
Okay. It's been a momentous 2 hours, and the Conservatives have their biggest majority in decades after what had been dubbed the Brexit election. Yeah, 24 hours in which a lot has happened.
Well, we did it. We did it.
11%. I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign.
I'm proud that Liberal Democrats have been the unapologetic voice of Remain in this election, giving people the chance to choose to stop Brexit.
I'd like to congratulate Boris Johnson on his clear election victory. The time has come for clarity, and I hope the withdrawal agreement concluded together in October can be ratified as soon as possible ahead of the 31st of January.
This country deserves a break from wrangling, a break from politics, and a permanent break from talking about Brexit. Thank you all very much, and happy Christmas. Thank you.
Yeah, because that was one of the big issues going into this election. It's the first time, well, I think since the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken, Nico, HINES, that an election's taking place in the run-up to Christmas. How does it feel? We're still hearing, those Christmas songs you always do when you come to the UK around this time of year. The lights are up. Does it feel like Christmas today in London?
I think Christmas does begin now that this is over with. I think a lot of people were very frustrated that Boris Johnson was holding this election during the Christmas period. It just kind of sums up the way politics has interfered in people's lives. They're used to having an election here every 4 or 5 years, and it's always in the summer. And there's been 3 elections in 5 years now, and people are sick of it.
They're sick of it, you say, but 2/3 of the population came out to vote. It's only, 1% lower the turnout than it was in 2017 when it was in late May.
I think people realise this is important, and they have wanted to get Brexit done, it turns out. Boris Johnson's phrase cut through, and people thought, look, if we can have one last push here, then it can all go away. Of course, it won't be as simple as that in real life, but I think that's what people were hoping to do.
So what happened?
It's an interesting system in Britain because so easily the whole thing can topple in one direction. And I spent the last few days in traditional Labour heartlands, in the Midlands, in the North, in North Wales, and people there were absolutely furious about Brexit not having been delivered. Even people who had voted to remain in the first place just thought that it had to be done. And this is obviously not everywhere in the country, but in these traditional Labour areas. And the other thing that really came across strongly, and I was actually shocked by, was the real vitriolic disdain and hatred for Jeremy Corbyn.
Even in Labour strongholds?
That's what surprised me so much. I realised that he was unpopular, and if you look at the opinion polls, you'll see that he's one of the most unpopular leaders in British political history. But when you actually go and knock on doors, like I did, sometimes with Labour campaigners, sometimes just on my own, and people would open the door and you would say, what do you think is what's going to make you vote this time? And straight away people said, Jeremy Corbyn.
But hang on. Jeremy Corbyn, we know he's a closet leaver, right? He's somebody who's not really a big fan of the European Union. He's left-wing. Shouldn't that be all the kinds of things that appeal to those working class voters that you went to see?
That's what the Labour Party thought would happen. What's happened in reality is that for some reason or another, and partly this is tied up with Brexit because, Jeremy Corbyn tried to play both sides cleverly. He tried to pretend he was sort of in between the two and that he was a moderator and would help both sides. And actually what people out there who wanted Brexit to be done thought was, you're not telling the truth, you're just delaying things. But I think that's only one part of Jeremy Corbyn's unpopularity. People just don't like him. For some reason, they've taken against him. Partly they think people were saying things like, he's a Marxist, he's a communist. And these are Labour voters. He's too left for me. Some people were saying, I'll vote for him with a heavy heart. Other people were saying, I'm just not going to vote this time. Other people were saying, for the first time in my life, I'm going to vote Conservative.
So what happened in 2 years? Because in 2017, remember he made that great comeback. Theresa May never got her outright majority.
I think when Theresa May called that election, people didn't really know who Jeremy Corbyn was. And there was a bit of excitement. He was new, he was fresh, he seemed like a nice guy. And there was a real wave of excitement about him being a kind of left-wing candidate. And there was a lot of genuine momentum behind the party. And yes, they fell short, but they did much better than predicted. And what happened was the Labour Party thought, and Jeremy Corbyn's core leadership team thought, well, what we need to do is we need to double everything that we offered last time and make it an even bigger pledge this time in order to just go that extra little step further. And frankly, people just didn't believe that it was realistic, that they'd be able to deliver everything that they were promising.
All right. You mentioned how it's a system where it doesn't take much for it to swing one way or the other. That is certainly true. If you look at the numbers, a margin of plus 78 for the Conservatives, the tally, even though if you look at the popular vote overall, it's only plus 1% for the Conservatives. Now, while it's true that support for Labour dwindled badly, we saw, for instance, the Liberal Democrats, their share of the vote nationally up 4%. They're only sending to Westminster one fewer member of Parliament. And Nico, HINES, as correspondent for the Daily Beast, based in New York, I know over there they talk a lot about the Electoral College and the system is unfair. I'm kind of starting to hear the same thing from those on the losing side here.
The system here is unfair in a sense, but it's a feature rather than a bug. So one of the reasons that the British system has always produced stable government, so we haven't had as many coalitions, we don't have these stories like in Italy where the government's falling every few months, usually, is because the system is set up so that whichever side is slightly ahead, that will be a domino effect across the country and you'll get a big, strong majority. So if you actually look back, Tony Blair's 2005 electoral victory, he only got 35% of the overall vote and he still had a majority. So you only need to be a little bit ahead in order to secure a majority as long as your votes fall in the right share of places across the country.
And 52%, according to pollsters, of those who cast ballots, according to what they found in their surveys, are Remainers. So where does that leave the UK?
Yeah, well, this is another part of the system. The reason that the Conservatives did so well is because they basically consolidated all of the levers to back them. Boris Johnson's single-minded campaign, just repeating over and over again, get Brexit done, succeeded in convincing all of those Brexit Party people or all people who support other parties to fall behind the Conservatives on this issue, whereas the Remain vote was splintered all over the place. You had 5 or 6 parties who wanted to remain, and they all got a share of the vote here and there. There were efforts to get tactical voting to work, but it's difficult to explain to the average person who doesn't really follow politics that closely who they're supposed to vote for in what seat. There were lots of places in London where Remain had a huge majority, where Labour and the Liberal Democrats both did very well, but the Conservative Party just snuck through the middle because the Remain vote was split between them.
You mentioned that slogan, get Brexit done, 3 simple words. I noticed this early this morning when he came out to do his victory speech. Suddenly there was a new slogan here. It's, the people's government. 4 words, not 3, but still, what does that mean, the people's government?
It's hard to say, isn't it? It almost sounds a little bit scary. Like, what are they threatening us with if we're not backing this people's government?
It's this use of the word people. Is that what's scaring you?
Right, and it makes you think, well, so if we're against this government, are we against the people somehow? I think it all plays into these same simple narratives that served so well in the Leave campaign and helped win Brexit in the first place. And Dominic Cummings, who was the mastermind behind that campaign, is now in number 10, masterminding this election campaign. And I suspect that if we've seen People's Government once on a banner, get used to seeing it, because it's going to be over and over and over again.
All right, that's going to be over and over again. And what's running over and over in my mind is that tweet by Donald Trump congratulating Boris Johnson, saying we're going to do a much better trade deal than with the European Union.
Yeah, well, this is another example. It's Boris Johnson is not popular in this country. His ratings are not good. His approval ratings are not strong, and people don't like the fact that he's associated with Donald Trump in some ways. People don't like the fact that he might sell out the NHS as they see it by doing a trade deal that would allow US pharmaceutical companies to come into our health service. But they were willing to overlook it. The most common thing you found when you spoke to people on the street was, look, I don't like Boris Johnson, but... And so this Donald Trump intervention, you could say, oh, it's damaging to Boris Johnson, and it is. And these things will all add up, and there's a good chance that in 2 or 3 years, Boris Johnson will be an incredibly unpopular Prime Minister. But for now, people are willing to overlook anything to get this deal. And Boris Johnson does need some of these trade deals to be able to say to those people who've lent him their votes this time, look, I promised you I'd get you good trade deals, here they are.
All right, one final question for you, Nico HINES. You're in the coverage of this election. You went on your road trip. You're back in London, which you call Romania sometimes, because do you feel as though this divide between the southeast and the rest of the country, can it be bridged, or is it just going to grow wider and wider and wider?
I think it's going to grow wider and wider. I think what we have seen, it depends how Boris Johnson does in office, I suppose, but I think what's obvious is that there's been a real flip in the way people's loyalties are in this country, and people who are more highly educated, who live in cities, are increasingly all gathering up to become Labour supporters in a way that wasn't the case. In Margaret Thatcher's day, for example, there were loads of Conservative seats in London, but now there are so few, and the only Labour gain last night was in Putney in southwest London, which is one of the wealthiest, most well-to-do areas of London, which traditionally you would think, therefore, would be suited to a Conservative approach. But Brexit means that even the most highly paid, affluent Londoners still identify more with Remain than they would with this new Conservative, Brexit-inflected party.
All right, Nico HINES, whose coverage on Brexit, on the UK general elections is on the Daily Beast's website. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And we were talking a minute ago about Donald Trump and how his tweet, how it went down or not. There was an EU summit taking place the last 2 days. Our Europe editor, Catherine Nicholson, telling us they didn't talk much about Donald Trump, but they did talk a lot about the UK, saying at least with this big victory, they're sad to see Brexit happening, but they're happy that at least there is some kind of resolution, that we know which way things are going.
Et donc la France en particulier.
France is passionately committed to its relationship with the UK, which has been forged through history and geography. Once there's clarity on legal and institutional levels, we'll drive forward together over the next few months and build a common future.
And to react to what Emmanuel Macron is saying, who else but to turn to but France 24's London correspondent Bénédicte. How are you?
I am fine. What a historic day. Seismic, actually, and somewhat unexpected.
We've had a lot of seismic days since, over the last 5 years, right?
It's been extraordinary. It is extraordinary. and the Brexit referendum, of course, was not predicted by the polls. The catastrophic election that the previous Prime Minister ran, Theresa May, couldn't get her deal through Parliament. It's just been a roller coaster. Twists and turns.
Before I ask you about whether or not we're going to see a little more closure in that building across the river there, you heard Emmanuel Macron there, his words, and I want to ask you personally. You're my compatriot. We're both French. And there's a lot of people that are like you in London. London is this cosmopolitan place where you have people from various nationalities and who like the continent and are turned towards the continent. What's the feeling now?
Well, I think people are. It's the morning or the evening after.
Because this is it. Brexit's happening.
Well, this is what is extraordinary, really, because there's been such paralysis. There's been so much talk. You can't go into a pub, almost take a cab ride or something. It comes up in conversation again and again, and people have very entrenched views. So we've said it, but we cannot overemphasize how divisive the subject is. It's literally broken up families, divided families, marriages, partnerships. There are even people who said, get rid of that girlfriend or that boyfriend because they're on the other side of the divide. So it's been quite extraordinary. And of course, we had the 6-month lead up to the 2016 referendum. But how does it feel? Well, London is an extraordinary city. I'm half French, half British. So I've really got a foot in both cultures. And it is quite extraordinary to see, on the one hand, people who passionately love Europe, buy houses in France and elsewhere in Europe. But you see, it's quite funny because they still say going to Europe. And I think there's that island mentality on some level. But I think President Macron is completely right to say this is a moment of clarification. Boris Johnson has obtained a decisive victory. And of course, all these summits, EU summits, that have been absolutely dominated by Brexit, that uncertainty for investors in the UK, whether they're British or international, the pound's really gone up, and there really has, investment has been flatlining. And so let's see. But of course, on the 31st of January, it'll be phase 1, if indeed that is the deadline that is respected. And then there'll be phase 2, and that's going to be quite complex.
Negotiating the trade deal.
Negotiating the trade deal, allegedly by the end of 2020. But will we see a Boris Johnson who, actually having obtained this huge, by normal sense of having had such no closure, complete open wound in Parliament, will he feel freer to not be bound by and lengthen the transition? It's going to be absolutely fascinating to watch. Will he go back to instincts that are different? A lot of question marks as to how he's not going to feel bound, for example, by the European Research Group and by more.
Yeah, just explain to our viewers. The European Research Group is the hard Brexiters in his party. He doesn't need them anymore, right? He doesn't need them. Doesn't need the DUP, which had a very bad night. The Ulster Unionist Party, to whom he was beholden up until now.
More nationalists than that's another phenomenon we shouldn't underrate. The fact that there are more nationalists now than unionists in Northern Ireland. The fact that you've got a re-energised Nicola Sturgeon, not just the leader of the SNP, the Scottish National Party, but the first minister in Scotland, and very strongly saying, you do not have a mandate, Boris Johnson, in Scotland. She's wrong. He's the UK Prime Minister. He does have a mandate.
He's UK Prime Minister. And so you were saying, we don't know which Boris Johnson it's going to be. Could it be you remember the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson?
Oh, yes. Yeah, so I already think that some of the language he was using, whether it was the Count in Uxbridge, whether it was then after going to see the Queen, is slightly more inclusive. I think it's fascinating that the NHS also, let's not just talk about Brexit, is so prominent.
Yeah, the National Health Service, he said it was his top priority.
Which is extraordinary, and that is where actually the Labour Party that has done catastrophically badly, that is having an inquest but doesn't seem to be in a rush to get rid of its leader, or at least its leader doesn't want to leave immediately. He wants a period of reflection. That policy has actually really affected, in that sense, the Conservatives. So it's going to be quite extraordinary to see 20,000 more police officers. What we need to tell our audience is 20,000 more, well, more because 20,000 were cut before under the austerity cuts. So this is where I think trust has been in very short supply in the British political class. And when you talk, as you will have in the streets of London, but also across the country, there's a real short supply of trust in politicians. And that is not good for any of our democracies.
Yeah, you mentioned the cuts and the welfare state. Bénédicte, I don't know if you've spoken to your family back home, but there's been demonstrations in France this week over pension reform. And it seems as though it's the common thread, the fear of insecurity, if you will, over the future, over what government's going to deliver. In that sense, Britain's a lot more like France than it is like the United States, and that here people want their welfare state to remain as it is.
Well, Britain is in a class of its own. I mean, the National Health Service, which was initially a Labour project, is an extraordinary privilege. So in that sense, I wouldn't compare it to France. But of course, our Western democracies, the populations are getting older. So and when Britain looks at France, they think, hold on a second, incredible, you can retire at 52 or 50 or
only if you're
23 pension reforms.
Only if you're a rail driver or a policeman. But anyway,
but it's quite extraordinary.
But the question
to a
is
British
here,
person.
is it all these years of austerity? Because we're not having that conversation anymore, or are we having it, or is it just about Brexit?
No, it's not just about Brexit at all. It has been a lot about the National Health Service, people on trolleys and corridors, the staff themselves busting a gut to try and help everybody. But underfunding of the police, the intelligence services, and oversights, for example, with the probation service, when unfortunately 2 weeks ago I had to rush to London Bridge for the terrorist attack. And it turns out that man, Usman Khan, should have, the terrorist who was neutralised, killed by British police, after killing 2 people, injuring 5 other people, should have had somebody actually accompanying him. So, and that's something to watch out for with Boris Johnson, because although he's been accused by the father of one of the people who was killed of politicising it, he has made very clear for a long time, and again within that weekend, that he wants proper custodial sentences. He wants terrorists and people who've committed violence. So watch out for that aspect as well of Boris Johnson.
One final question for you. You who read the French press, do you think the French get what's going on here?
Sometimes, and my colleagues who are here really make a real effort to go up and down the country and not just to be London-centric. I think sometimes they've been banging their heads with frustration at the paralysis in Parliament, but respecting also the fact that it's democracy at work. It's meant to be the mother of all parliaments. We did have, I must say, as President of the Foreign Press here, we had John Bercow within days of him standing down, the Speaker, now world-famous Speaker, and he told us in our briefing, international foreign press briefing, that Brexit was the single biggest mistake that this country, the United Kingdom, had made since World War II. So, of course, all our British colleagues were absolutely trying to get to him within minutes of getting that briefing. So I think we've still got a very divided country, and the healing does, on any level, need to begin. There's no doubt about that. But how and when and how soon can that be accomplished?
All right, Bénédicte PAVIOT, our correspondent in London, many thanks.
Thank you. And do come back to London soon.
Soon.
Yeah. Maybe not for a general election.
Okay.
Let's give that a bit of a rest.
All right, many thanks. The Bénédicte PAVIOT there mentioning how the healing has to begin. Of course, with such a big majority, Boris Johnson, well, he's got 5 years ahead of him, and he's going to have to do that healing not just between left and right, not just between north and south, but with all of the United Kingdom, and laying down the gauntlet, one of the big winners of Thursday's vote, the Scottish nationalists.
People in Scotland will have made very clear that they didn't want Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, that they don't want Brexit, and they want Scotland's future to be in Scotland's hands. And there is a mandate now to offer the people of Scotland a choice over our own future. That mandate already existed, and it has been reinforced.
And we are pleased to welcome, to talk about it all, to Cindy Yu, broadcast editor for The Spectator. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We just heard the Scottish nationalists in that clip saying, well, this is a sign. Is it a sign that there could be a breakup of the United Kingdom?
I think it's definitely more likely today than it was this time yesterday. What the Scottish Nationalists have done is increase their seats by 13 in a small area of the country, a sizable area of the country, but in just one country, and up to 48 seats. So they are now the biggest party in Scotland and bigger than they were in 2017, which means that there's going to be an increased demand for a second independence referendum. Whether or not Westminster listens is obviously another question. What I think will be interesting to see is 2021, Holyrood will have their own elections, the Scottish Assembly will have their own elections. If the SNP come out on top there, then the moral demand for second independence referendum will be so high that maybe Westminster will have to buckle.
Yeah, because Scotland voted Remain.
Well, Scotland voted Remain, as well as SNP's flagship policy is to break up the United Kingdom. It's not as if you can say, oh, I voted SNP for other reasons. That is their most main policy. So if they do win more electoral victories, then that is a clear sign that Scotland wants to have another say.
So hang on, let's get this straight. We heard earlier Emmanuel Macron say, at least we have clarification, at least we have a definitive outcome. But then we have Scotland. There are protests going on as we speak. We perhaps can be showing images outside of Parliament. When do you bury the hatchet here?
Well, I think Macron meant clarity with Brexit, and it is definitely, almost certainly, 98% we're definitely going to leave on January 31st, because Boris Johnson's majority is so big that any vote that he brings to Parliament will just go through without any blink of an eye. The question of Scottish independence will not come up for another few years, I think, and also bearing in mind the Alex Salmond trial. So Alex Salmond is the former leader of the SNP, and he is accused of sexual assault and rape in a number of cases, and that court trial starts next year. So how big of a PR hit to the SNP will that be? That's also a question. The Scottish referendum is, maybe is on the horizon, but it's certainly not close yet. For now, Brexit will happen, and that's the clarity.
All right, that's the clarity, and it seems as though everybody's still energized. We talked about, people being each one in their own bubble, each one in with their own echo chambers. People were shocked in a lot of instances. We witnessed it when the results came in, and pollsters said, no, you shouldn't have been shocked. We saw this coming. Your thoughts on that?
Well, not many pollsters see this coming. They can say it now. They can say it's within their margin of error. But at the same time, most polls said that it was going to be a small majority, or maybe even a hung parliament. So I think what really happened is that the swing in these constituencies were so small that a couple of tens of thousands of people across the country turning out changed the dynamic hugely because of first past the post, which also means that this echo chamber point is so interesting. I have today, my social circle, a lot of them voted Corbyn, and they are so shocked that the country could be voting for a so-called racist Prime Minister as Boris Johnson, and not really understanding why the other side think that Corbyn himself is anti-Semitic or enabling anti-Semites. I think Twitter in the UK really enables that. You put yourself in an echo chamber by designing who you follow and who you listen to.
It's not been the easiest general election for the media as a whole.
Yeah, that's true. There's been a lot of disinformation in this campaign, much of it coming from the Conservative campaign itself, a lot of edited videos going onto social media, and then sometimes journalists reporting things without properly fact-checking. There was an incident earlier this week when Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary and the Conservative Minister, went to a hospital, and there was a rumour that his advisor had been hit by a Labour activist. Now, that was spread on Twitter by some notable journalists without proper fact-checking, and, things like that is the medium of social media allows it to happen much more quickly. You don't have an editor.
But also venerable institutions like the BBC coming under attack?
Yes, absolutely. But that's on the medium of Twitter. You wouldn't see a BBC online or print article going through that. So, I think, journalists need to understand this new medium and how to really do with it. There's a saying in the UK that, we have analogue elections for a digital age, and we need to basically get ready for that digital age.
So, Cindy, the reason we make you stand out in the freezing cold for this show is because we're tourists, we're in town, and, when you're a foreigner and you come here to London and you look at that building, you are impressed. There is that weight of time. It is a majestic building, and it does mean something for the whole world. I know that you've reported on the protests in Hong Kong, yes. And how's the UK's democracy doing? Tell us.
Well, I hope from today onwards it would be doing much better. I think the last 3 years have been, I'm not a Brexiteer, but I think the last 3 years of back and forth has been so damaging for both sides. You know, Remainers from day one didn't accept the result, and Brexiteers wanted ever harder Brexit versions. You know, that's been incredibly toxic. And what we know from Hong Kong is that sometimes you push a populace so far that they can't ever come back together again. And there's just so much distrust and so much disinformation out there that, you know, it's impossible to have mutual discourse. Today onwards, Boris Johnson struck a very humble tone. You know, in his speech outside Downing Street and to the Conservative Party, he said, I know a lot of voters just lent me your votes, and I know I'm not your natural choice, but I'm going to try to unite this country. So let's see what he does with the majority. I think it's promising.
Did he surprise you?
With that humble tone? Yes, he did, actually. I think it was a self-aware tone. You know, he wasn't gloating. He wasn't saying, look at me, I've won all these Labour seats, you know, they obviously like me much more than Corbyn. He was saying, you know, I know a lot of you don't like the Conservatives, and I know a lot of you would never have considered voting Conservative were it not for Corbyn and Brexit, and I'm really glad that you have. But compare that to Jeremy Corbyn's tone. No self-awareness, no sort of introspection of what he did wrong to do this. He said he was sad but proud. Proud of what? The worst Labour defeat, you know, in the last probably century. So yeah.
And how does a publication like The Spectator play what's going to happen next? And again, that negotiation over what kind of a trade deal with the European Union, what kind of relationship, what's the view?
Well, so there's a joke in the office, actually, that we were actually hoping for hung parliament because then we'd sell more magazines because political volatility is good for journalists. But, I mean, The Spectator does want, you know, a Conservative majority, and we're looking forward to having that sort of Conservative agenda moving forward rather than just constantly being stuck in this argument whether or not Brexit is going to happen. So now that we know where we're heading, let's just go ahead with it. In terms of the deal itself, I think we haven't thought that far, to be honest. But it is exciting time. It's also an exciting time to stop talking about Brexit. You know, getting Brexit done means we can talk about social care, we can talk about housing, we can talk about education, all these other things.
And did you believe Boris Johnson when he said, oh, my top priority is the NHS? Did you believe him when he said that?
Well, I mean, I think the thing holding him true on this case is those red wall Labour voters that for once voted for the Conservatives. You know, he needs to keep them on side. He did so well to get them on side this election, and if he doesn't, you know, make good of that promise on NHS and more spending, then they're not going to come back to him, and it'll be a flagship pledge destroyed, and the trust in Conservatives will be utterly destroyed.
When you look back, Cindy, you at this campaign, at this wintertime campaign, what will be the moment that you think you'll remember a long time?
Gosh, there's been so many moments, but actually the moment I think I was most surprised and shocked was last week when Boris Johnson was made to look at that picture of a 4-year-old boy on an NHS hospital floor, and he just didn't know how to react to it. I don't know if your viewers have seen that video, but he refused to answer the question. He refused to look at the journalist's phone with the picture on it, and then he pocketed the journalist's phone. You know, campaigns are stressful things. You are vetted with lines. You need to stick to your lines. You need to stick to your message. But to have such a bizarre automatic response, like he was on autopilot, not a human sympathetic response, I think, you know, he was very lucky that did not decide the election for him.
All right, Cindy Yu, many thanks. Cindy Yu of The Spectator, and you'll be, of course, the coverage continues. What's your cover? Do you know yet for the next edition?
Yes, we do know. It's actually Boris Johnson opening a big present under the Christmas tree, and the present itself is the door of number 10.
All right. Well, Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you very much.
All right, Cindy Yu of The Spectator. Yeah, mentioning how it's not just about Brexit. There are these bread and butter issues, like, for instance, in the northeastern seaside town of Grimsby, which had voted Labour for the last 74 years until this Thursday when they elected a Conservative.
I didn't vote for them last time when in the 80s and 70s and 80s. I didn't vote for them. I voted Labour back then. Conservative got in and literally trashed the country. She destroyed the fishing industry, steel industry, the coal industry, you name it, it all went downhill from there. But now I'm hoping Conservatives will look back on their mistakes, and I'm hoping they're going to bring some things back.
I think it's just a time of general discontent, and I think all extremes are quite dissatisfied. So I think that everybody is willing to question maybe where they wouldn't have before and go against what they may normally vote for.
And to react to those comments that we heard, Labour voters who traditional Labour voters who've turned their backs in Grimsby on the party. We're joined by Paul Mason, a journalist, filmmaker, writer, the author of A Clear Bright Future, a radical defense of the human being. Thanks for being with us here on this brisk Friday the 13th.
It's great. Well, as a Labour supporter, obviously, we're pretty devastated at the loss, okay? We tried to defend Britain's links with the European Union. We offered people either a form of Brexit that would maintain effective membership of the single market and, importantly, freedom of movement for 2.7 million European citizens in our country, or to stay in Europe. This for us was about more than just principle. Right here where we're standing, we're opposite the Parliament. We're in a parliamentary constituency called Vauxhall. I live here. And it's one of the most unequal places in Britain. There is abject poverty in the streets just 100 metres away from where we're standing. They voted 57% for Labour. They voted 50, maybe 60% to stay in Europe. This is also the working class. This is also the people of Britain. So the problem we have is we have a culture war. And you saw it there in Grimsby. You see the way in which some working class people in small towns, very similar to the Gilets jaunes movement in France, have given up on a metropolitan, on a globalist view of the world.
Because in Grimsby, they didn't just win. The Conservatives won by 7,300 votes.
No. The specific illusion behind that victory is that they're going to get control over Britain's fishing waters from Europe, because Grimsby is a fishing port. It's crazy. That's not going to happen. But this was the dream that was sold to them. The other specifics about Grimsby is that they had a very strongly pro-Brexit Labour MP. She said she voted for Brexit at every opportunity, and she said even if it's no deal, like this ultra right-wing fantasy of no deal Brexit, she would have voted for that, but she still lost her seat. So what's the problem? Let's paraphrase Leon Trotsky. Trotsky once said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. We have a culture war, and you may not be interested in a culture war, but it is going to affect politics in Britain. And until the left decides what it's going to do, I think it will be paralysed.
So I don't know how much sleep you got last night.
Not much, 2 hours.
2 hours.
Does it sound like it?
It seems to be standard. Everybody says 2 hours. No, you all seem fine. I'm amazed.
6 to 8. 6 to 8.
Okay. But you managed to, nonetheless, to pen a blog post in which you said, hey, I'm coming from the left. And I'm paraphrasing here. Yeah. And you said, but the only way forward is a coalition between the left and the center.
The German philosopher Hannah Arendt in the 1930s described a phenomenon like what we're seeing in Germany like this. She said it's an alliance of the elite and the mob. Now, I don't want to call anybody a mob, but you can see the problem. We have elite politicians like Boris Johnson, and then those people in Grimsby, people in my hometown Lee, voting for Conservatives. The only way you're going to defeat them is through an alliance of the centre and the left. Now, in Britain, if you look at the results, the centre and the left did not want an alliance. They did not want to join together, even tactically, to defeat Boris Johnson. I think going forward, especially for my party, Labour, even within our own party, the centre and the left are going to have a common project, and until we do, we will not get into power.
And when was the last time that was successful? Because Tony Blair, he didn't make any alliance with the left.
He didn't, and I think that this is the problem. There will be siren calls to repeat Blairism, but if you look what happened to the political centre last night, it disappeared. We had breakaways from the Conservatives towards the centre, they disappeared. Breakaways from Labour towards the centre, they disappeared from Parliament. This place place you referred earlier in the segment to the Parliament behind us is actually the most polarised it's ever been. So what we need to do, we need to take a social coalition of two sets of people. That is the metropolitan, skilled, educated workers and the poor ethnic minority people who live 100 metres away from here. That's one part of the coalition. The other part is the old ex-mining, ex-cotton, ex-industrial areas, and we need to give them something to believe in common. And I think that is what you do.
So what can you give them to believe in?
Look, by the time we come to the next election, the whole question of Brexit will be over. Brexit is going to happen. Scotland will probably leave the United Kingdom in this generation, I think. Now, that means in the remains of England and Wales, that's what we're going to be left with, a kind of rump UK, a kind of remnant of UK. You have to have an electoral coalition that's much broader to defeat the Conservatives. Otherwise, that my fear is that we're going to end up with a managed democracy. So there will be elections every 5 years, but the press will be heavily influenced by the government. You heard earlier about how they're trying to do that. And the only one party can ever win the election. So we need to reconfigure the left to a future orientation, and above all to avoid the problem of nostalgia, that we can ever get these places back by appealing to some of the xenophobia and racism that I have heard repeatedly on the doorstep.
Yeah, you used some strong language. You talked about for 45% of the population in this country, it's always and only about Brexit, migration, and English nationalism. You say English nationalism.
Well, this is, I am English, but I don't feel English. I wasn't brought up to be English. I was brought up to be British. But there's a new English nationalism out there. Look, the job of a journalist, I think, is to tell the truth and to speak from experience. I campaigned in 18 separate places where I feared we were not going to win. I have heard in my face levels of racism spoken to by white person to white person that would not be acceptable anywhere inside a corporation, a school, a university. Now, it's not fashionable to say this. Because we are a former imperial power, there is an assumption of supremacy and privilege by many white working class people that some of the MPs who represented them never challenged. This is the problem. So as soon as our party began to 3 years ago identify with a metropolitan and globalist vision of the world, those workers were turned off. So you have to be honest about that. And what's good, what's positive, is that in those very same places, younger workers, equally poor, equally working class, do not accept those values, and we have to represent them.
All right, Paul Mason, explain it to us, because earlier Nico HINES from the Daily Beast was telling us how in covering this election, he went to these Labour Leave constituencies and was surprised to see on doorsteps the amount of vitriol directed not at Boris Johnson, but at Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. So if you accept that there is now a culture war in Britain, the same as there is in the United States, there is a war over values. I think that I would define it as nativist. The assumption that because my grandfather was a coal miner, I should be able to have a greater say in the future of this country than a taxi driver who came from Pakistan 20 years ago, which we as socialists reject. This nativist assumption is there, and they look at Corbyn and they sense a lack of empathy with them, and that is true. Corbyn is not a nativist. He is a profoundly anti-racist politician, and I think that plus Jeremy made some mistakes. Jeremy himself, I think, was not empathetic enough with the very different conditions in which such people live. He doesn't live in them himself. He represents a constituency, again, like here, very poor, very multi-ethnic. And I think that we needed more northern politicians. We needed more politicians of stature who were able to cross that divide.
Because as I was saying to Nico, he's kind of a closet leaver. Why wouldn't they identify with him?
You know, the interesting thing is, Jeremy Corbyn was a left leaver before he became the leader of the Labour Party. But he stuck fairly rigorously to the script that the party outlined for him. That is, we are critical Remainers. And remember, it was our job to say the Brexit that Boris Johnson will now inflict is an attack on the working class. I believe that to be true. Jeremy Corbyn believes that to be true. We didn't just we didn't just oppose Brexit and Boris Johnson's hard Brexit just because we want to pander to the metropolitan, multi-ethnic population of London. We did it because we believe it is an attack. No, they don't. And you spoke earlier to one of the previous guests about the parliamentary traditions of Britain. What we're up against in Britain is that sovereignty is very profoundly built into our parliamentary democracy. And when people saw twice their vote the leave vote didn't happen, they said, if Parliament isn't going to do it, we need to do it ourselves. No, we have to listen to that. So Brexit is for me a closed question. It will happen. There's no question that the left will in some way fight for return to Europe.
Two very quick questions because we're running short on time. First of all, when it came to Jeremy Corbyn, the anti-Semitism, what did he do wrong in that case? Because it really did become a big issue.
Yeah, I think that Jeremy Corbyn and, more importantly, the advisors around him could not see how this completely manageable problem was going to get out of hand. He is not an anti-Semite. He honestly, he's spent his life fighting racism and anti-Semitism. However, what they couldn't see was an argument within the labour movement between two traditions within Jewish life, which is Zionism and Bundism, which is anti-Zionist Judaism, was basically going to rip the party apart. And they couldn't deal with it, and the worse it got, the worse their reaction got. And I think that we need to look. There is an inquiry here by the official body, the anti-racist body in Britain, to determine whether their administrative reaction was racist. We'll find that out.
And finally, one of the questions you posed in that blog post, which is, well, Britain's standing in the world.
Yeah. The global system is breaking up. President Macron has said, that the NATO problem is just part of the breakup of a global system. We need a strong Europe. Britain has stood us apart from it. It can no longer dictate on the diplomacy or the military cooperation or the security cooperation. This country is free floating, as it were, in mid-Atlantic right now. And I fear that it will move much more decisively in the American direction. And that, again, will provoke yet another big culture war in Britain.
All right, and there's 5 years of Boris Johnson ahead of us, it seems. Paul Mason, many thanks for being with us.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
And thank you for joining us here for this London edition of The World This Week. More coverage on the UK elections on our website, France24.com.